At 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, inside a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., 7 sealed envelopes were handed to 7 different attorneys. Each envelope carried the same weight. Each name inside had stood beside power for years. I've learned something in 6 decades of watching capital move through systems: silence has a price, and someone always pays it. By 9:47 a.m., the first leak had already hit the wire. The phones started ringing. The cameras started rolling. And the carefully constructed walls around the inner circle began to crack. Stay to the end, because what unfolded in the hours that followed didn't just expose individuals. It exposed the architecture of loyalty itself. This isn't a story about politics. It's a story about accountability, and what happens when the system designed to enforce it finally decides to move. For months, questions circulated. Testimonies were delayed. Documents were redacted. Calendars were cleared. Witnesses developed sudden memory lapses. But subpoenas don't negotiate. They don't wait for convenient timing. They arrive, and they demand. So the question isn't whether the inner circle knew this was coming. The question is, why did they think they could outrun it? And more importantly, what changed? What shifted in the mechanism of enforcement that made this Tuesday morning different from the dozens of Tuesday mornings that came before it? Let's trace how we got here. 7 names. 7 subpoenas. 7 individuals who spent years building proximity to the center of power. I'm not interested in their titles. I'm interested in their incentives. Because in any system, whether it's a boardroom or a war room, behavior follows incentive. And when the incentive is survival, loyalty becomes liquid. These weren't foot soldiers. They were advisors. Strategists. Confidants. The kind of people who don't take notes in meetings because they are the notes. They were present in rooms where decisions were made that never appeared in official transcripts. They carried messages that never traveled through formal channels. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, how power moves when it doesn't want to be tracked. But here's what I've observed across every industry, every institution, every collapse I've studied: proximity to power creates 2 things: influence and liability. And when subpoenas land, influence evaporates. What remains is liability. So they hired attorneys. They lawyered up within hours. That's not guilt, but it's not innocence either. It's calculation. It's the recognition that the rules of the game just shifted. That the protections they assumed were permanent might actually be temporary. That being close to power is an asset right up until the moment it becomes a liability. Delay is currency, and they were buying time, but time, like any commodity, has a market price. And that price just went up. Let me explain something I learned early in my career, something that applies to markets, governments, and human systems alike. Trust is not a feeling. Trust is a structure. It's built on predictability, transparency, and enforcement. When any one of those 3 pillars weakens, the structure doesn't bend, it collapses. And the collapse is rarely slow. I've watched companies lose 40% of their market cap in a single trading session, not because their product failed, but because their accounting did. I've seen banks with centuries of reputation vanish in 72 hours because the trust beneath them liquefied. Governments operate on the same principle. When citizens believe the rules apply equally, institutions hold. When they believe the rules apply selectively, institutions fracture. And fractures don't announce themselves. They show up in small signals first: delayed hearings, missing documents, witnesses who suddenly can't recall, subpoenas that sit unsigned for weeks. Each delay is a micro-collapse of trust. And here's the part most people miss. You don't need corruption to destroy trust. You just need the appearance of protection. When the inner circle gets subpoenaed and the public asks, why did this take so long? That question is the crack. It's the moment when citizens stop believing the system is neutral. When they start calculating whether the rules bend differently for different people. When they begin to suspect that proximity to power comes with invisible shields. And once that suspicion takes root, it doesn't matter what the investigation uncovers. The damage is already done. Because trust, unlike stock prices, doesn't recover with a good earnings report. Trust requires consistent proof over extended time. It requires transparency even when transparency is uncomfortable. It requires enforcement even when enforcement is politically inconvenient. Markets collapse when confidence does. Governments aren't any different, ***, that's not cynicism. That's system design. And this system just sent a signal. A signal that says, the process still exists. That accountability hasn't been entirely negotiated away. That proximity to power doesn't guarantee immunity from questions. Whether that signal is strong enough to rebuild trust remains to be seen. But it's the first signal we've seen in months. Now let's talk about what actually leaked. At 11:03 a.m., less than 2 hours after the subpoenas were served, a partial list of names appeared on a secure reporting platform used by investigative journalists. Not the full list. Just enough to confirm what many suspected. The list included a former chief of staff who spent 18 months at the center of daily operations, 2 senior legal advisors who specialized in executive privilege and constitutional boundaries, a campaign strategist who transitioned into an informal advisory role post-election, a communications director responsible for message coordination across multiple channels, and 2 individuals whose roles were never formally disclosed but whose names appeared repeatedly in visitor logs and travel manifests. That last part matters. Because when you subpoena someone whose job title doesn't exist on any official org chart, you're not fishing. You're following a map. A map that was built from phone records, email metadata, financial transactions, and testimony from individuals who've already cooperated. By 2 p.m., the leaks expanded. A memo surfaced, undated, unsigned, but authenticated by metadata, outlining a meeting that occurred 6 days before a critical vote. The memo contained one line that stopped everyone cold, *, delay until post-certification. Coordinate through secondary channels only. Let me repeat that. Delay until post-certification. Coordinate through secondary channels only. So what does that mean? It means someone knew the timeline mattered. It means coordination wasn't accidental, it was designed. And it means the people in that room understood they were operating outside the primary process. I've read thousands of board memos. I've signed off on acquisition strategies that hinged on timing. I've reviewed communications that were carefully worded to avoid creating liability while still accomplishing strategic objectives. And I can tell you this with certainty, when language like secondary channels appears in internal communication, it's not about efficiency. It's about deniability. Primary channels leave records. They create paper trails. They generate logs that can be subpoenaed, reviewed, and entered into evidence. Secondary channels exist for one reason, to avoid that documentation. The memo dated September 23 listed no signatures. That's not paperwork, that's infrastructure for silence, ***, and infrastructure isn't built by accident. It's designed, tested, and deployed with intention. Which means this wasn't a moment of panic. It was a system. Let's slow down for a moment and look at the second document that emerged. This one wasn't a memo. It was a calendar export, a digital record pulled from a server that hadn't been wiped yet. The calendar showed a recurring meeting. Every Thursday at 4 p.m. No subject line. No attendees listed by name. Just a location code, Secure Room B. The meetings ran for 11 consecutive weeks. Investigators cross-referenced the calendar with entry logs from the building. Every week, the same 7 people checked in. And every week, their phones were logged into a Faraday pouch at the security desk. Now, I'm not a lawyer. But I know this much: when a group meets that consistently, in a secure room, without devices, and leaves no written agenda, they're not planning a birthday party. They're managing risk. Risk management takes many forms. Sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes it's strategic. Sometimes it crosses into something darker. But the pattern itself is unmistakable. Recurring meetings without documentation suggest an awareness that documentation creates exposure. Secure rooms suggest an awareness that conversations might be monitored. Faraday pouches suggest an awareness that devices can be tracked, hacked, or subpoenaed. The room froze when that calendar hit the public record. Because calendars don't lie. They don't forget. They don't revise their memory under pressure. They're timestamp engines. They prove presence. They establish patterns. And patterns, once established, become evidence of intent. Silence is just guilt in slow motion. Here's the mechanism everyone overlooks. This isn't about whether laws were broken. This is about who controls the clock. Let me explain. In any investigation, timing is leverage. If you can delay testimony, you can align stories. If you can delay documents, you can review what's already been said. If you can delay subpoenas, you can prepare defenses before questions are even asked. The problem isn't the delay itself. It's who controls the clock, and for months, the clock was controlled by the people now being subpoenaed. That's not a conspiracy. That's a structural advantage. When you're inside the system, you have visibility. You know what's being requested before it's formalized. You know which documents exist and where they're stored. You know which witnesses have already testified and what they've said. That information asymmetry is power. But subpoenas reset the clock. They say, you no longer set the schedule. The court does. And that shift, from internal control to external enforcement, is when loyalty starts to crack. Because loyalty is strongest when it's never tested. When it's theoretical. When it's about shared victories and mutual benefit. But when the cost of loyalty becomes personal risk. When maintaining the story might mean personal liability. That's when people start calculating. That's when attorneys start advising clients to cooperate fully, which is code for protect yourself first. The problem isn't the delay itself. It's who controls the clock, and the clock just changed hands. So here's what happens next. There are 2 paths from here, and both hinge on the same variable, compliance speed. Path 1 *, the subpoenaed individuals comply within the standard window, 10 business days. They provide testimony under oath, submit requested documents, and cooperate with follow-up depositions. If that happens, the investigation proceeds quietly. The public moves on. Trust takes a small hit, but the system holds. The news cycle shifts. The subpoenas become a footnote. And the structural questions about accountability fade back into the background noise of governance. Path 2 * compliance is delayed. Motions are filed to quash the subpoenas. Attorneys argue executive privilege, attorney-client protections, or national security concerns. Each delay triggers a secondary response from the court. Each secondary response generates headlines. And each headline erodes the one thing institutions can't survive without, the belief that the process is real. I've seen this play out in corporate litigation dozens of times. The companies that fight discovery the hardest are rarely the ones that win. They're the ones that lose trust faster than they lose the case. Because every motion to delay looks like an attempt to hide. Every invocation of privilege looks like an admission that something exists worth protecting. And public perception doesn't wait for legal conclusions. It forms in real time, based on behavior, not verdicts. If the court acts by Monday, trust survives. If not, precedent expires in silence, ***. This isn't speculation. It's pattern recognition. I've watched regulatory bodies fold under political pressure. I've watched oversight committees lose jurisdiction mid-investigation. I've watched evidence disappear, witnesses recant, and timelines stretch until public attention moved elsewhere. But I've also watched systems hold. I've seen courts refuse to budge. I've seen prosecutors continue despite immense pressure. I've seen institutions prove they're stronger than the individuals trying to capture them. The question is, which pattern are we watching now? Now, some will argue this is overreach. They'll say these are politically motivated subpoenas. They'll call it a witch hunt, a distraction, a weaponization of legal process. Let me respond to that carefully. I don't care about motive. I care about mechanism. A subpoena isn't a conviction. It's a question. And the appropriate response to a question, in any transparent system, is an answer. If there's nothing to hide, compliance costs nothing but time. If there's privilege to protect, the courts decide that, not the defendant. This is how the system is supposed to work. Questions get asked. Documents get reviewed. Testimony gets taken. And then, after all of that, conclusions get drawn. The problem isn't asking questions. The problem is preventing questions from being asked. They'll call it national security. But secrecy stops being protection when it starts protecting the powerful, ****. I've sat in enough classified briefings to know this. Real national security concerns don't leak. They don't show up in partial memos. They don't appear on unsecured calendars. What leaks is compromise. And what we're watching now isn't the investigation. It's the response to the investigation. That response tells you everything. Innocent parties welcome transparency. They provide documents voluntarily. They testify without subpoenas. They cooperate because cooperation vindicates them. Guilty parties delay. They invoke every available protection. They fight discovery. They claim harassment. And parties caught in the middle. They hire expensive lawyers and calculate which side of the line they want to land on. That calculation is happening right now. Let me take you back to a principle I've relied on for 50 years. Systems survive when process is impersonal. That means the rules don't change based on who you are, who you know, or how much power you hold. It means a subpoena served to a staffer carries the same weight as a subpoena served to a cabinet member. It means the timeline for compliance doesn't flex because your lawyer is famous. When process becomes personal, it stops being process. It becomes negotiation. And negotiated justice isn't justice. It's just delayed injustice. I've watched markets implode when regulators started granting exceptions. I've watched industries collapse when enforcement became selective. I've watched entire sectors lose legitimacy when the rules applied to small players but not large ones. The pattern is always the same. First, the insiders get a pass. Then, the public notices. Then, trust vanishes. Then, the whole structure comes down. And here's the cold truth: documents don't blink, they don't forget what happened in that room. They don't revise their testimony when the pressure mounts. Documents are the process. They're the permanent record that exists outside of memory, outside of spin, outside of political calculation. And when subpoenas demand documents, the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: it's enforcing accountability without regard for status. That's not partisan. That's structural. It's the difference between a system governed by rules and a system governed by relationships. In a rule-based system, everyone faces the same process. In a relationship-based system, proximity determines outcome. And once a system tips from rules to relationships, it doesn't come back easily. Because relationship-based systems reward loyalty over competence, silence over honesty, proximity over merit. They create incentives to hide rather than disclose. To delay rather than cooperate. To protect rather than reveal. Documents don't blink, that's not a slogan. That's the last line of defense between governance and chaos. Because if documents can be destroyed, hidden, or ignored without consequence, then the entire premise of accountability collapses. If the only evidence that matters is testimony, which can be shaped, forgotten, or revised, then truth becomes negotiable. And negotiable truth isn't truth. It's just power wearing a mask. So what's the lesson here? It's not about Trump. It's not about any one administration or investigation or courtroom. It's about the architecture of trust in institutional systems. When rules bend for convenience, they stop being rules. They become tools, and tools cut both ways. If the people at the center of power can delay accountability indefinitely, then accountability becomes theater. And once it becomes theater, the system loses the only currency it has: belief. Belief that the process is real. Belief that no one is above it. Belief that when something goes wrong, someone answers for it. I've lived through Watergate, Iran-Contra, financial crises, corporate frauds that vaporized billions. And every single time, the systems that survived were the ones that enforced the process, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Because pain is the price of credibility. Subpoenas are painful. Testimony is uncomfortable. Accountability is expensive. But the alternative is collapse. And collapse costs more than credibility. It costs trust itself. Trust is the foundation of every institution. Without it, laws become suggestions. Regulations become negotiable. And power flows not to those who follow the rules, but to those who can bend them without consequence. That's not governance. That's decay. And decay doesn't announce itself with a bang. It happens in 1,000 small compromises. In 1,000 delayed subpoenas. In 1,000 exceptions granted to those with the right connections. Until one day, the public looks at the system and sees not a structure designed to protect them, but a machine designed to protect itself. When rules bend for convenience, they stop being rules. They become tools, and tools cut both ways, asterisk, because the same mechanisms that protect power today can be used to challenge power tomorrow. The same precedents that allow delay can be invoked by anyone. And once everyone realizes the rules are negotiable, the system doesn't just lose legitimacy. It loses functionality. I don't make predictions. I watch systems. And I've spent 6 decades learning how to tell the difference between noise and signal. This is signal. The subpoenas aren't the story. The response to the subpoenas is the story. The question isn't what happened in those rooms. The question is, will the system prove it can still ask that question and get an answer? If clarity matters to you as much as truth, subscribe. Because the next episode isn't about what happened. It's about the 3 signals that decide whether systems hold or fracture. And those signals are already showing up. You just have to know where to look. We'll trace how enforcement either rebuilds trust or confirms its absence. How documents either vindicate the process or expose its capture. And how the next 30 days will determine whether accountability is real or performative. This isn't about taking sides. It's about understanding structure. And structure determines everything. Within 4 hours of the subpoenas being served, 3 hashtags trended simultaneously across every major platform. Hashtag SubpoenaWatch, hashtag InnerCircleExposed, hashtag AccountabilityNow. By evening, cable networks had cleared their primetime slots. And by midnight, 2 of the subpoenaed individuals had released statements through their attorneys. Both statements said the same thing, asterisk, we intend to cooperate fully with all lawful requests. Asterisk, notice the word they chose. Not, we welcome this opportunity. Not, we have nothing to hide. Lawful, that's lawyer speak for, we're complying, but we're also preparing to fight every single request in court. It's a signal that cooperation will come with conditions. That documents will be reviewed before they're produced. That testimony will be carefully prepared. And that's fine. That's how the system works. But it also tells you something else. The inner circle knows this is serious. If these were frivolous subpoenas, the response would be dismissive. If there was nothing to protect, the response would be immediate and unconditional. But carefully worded legal statements released through high-profile attorneys suggest something different. They suggest calculation. They suggest risk assessment. They suggest that somewhere, in a conference room with expensive hourly rates, a team is mapping out best-case and worst-case scenarios. The truth was never hidden, only delayed. But delay has a limit. And that limit just expired. Because once subpoenas are served, the clock isn't controlled by the subjects anymore. It's controlled by the court. And courts don't negotiate timelines based on political convenience. I've learned this much in a long life spent watching power, money, and systems collide. You don't protect democracy by delaying it. You protect it by enforcing the one rule that holds every other rule in place. No one gets to write their own subpoena. No one gets to decide when accountability arrives. And no one, no matter how close to power they stand, gets to control the clock forever. Documents don't forget. Courts don't blink. And trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself. It has to be earned back, one transparent decision at a time. One enforced subpoena at a time. One testimony under oath at a time. One document produced without delay at a time. That's not dramatic. That's just how institutions prove they still function. How they demonstrate that the process is stronger than the individuals trying to avoid it. How they signal to the public that the architecture of accountability is still intact. The subpoenas are the test. The response to the subpoenas is the answer. And the answer will determine whether the system survives this moment or becomes another case study in institutional decay. Truth is the real currency, and right now, it just came due. The market is open. The price is set. And payment is no longer optional.